Good afternoon and welcome. Good afternoon, welcome to you, and thanks for coming to this lecture presented by the Franke Program in Science and the Humanities. Some of you are familiar with the program, and others of you are visiting Yale, perhaps for the first time in a long while. Welcome to Yale. A hearty and warm welcome to the Whitney Humanities Center on this glorious day, which much of New England is embedded in a blizzard right now, but we seem to have dodged the bullet, as it were. The Franke Program in Science and the Humanities brings together diverse audiences to explore topics at the interface between science, technology, and the broader university, the broader areas of knowledge, focusing on the humanities. So we're excited to have you here today. I want to, as long as we have such a robust audience, I'm going to advertise our events coming up in the spring. Lots more of excitement. In particular, we'll be co-hosting with the Whitney Humanities Center the Schulman Lecture Series, organized around a course called Other Minds, about cognitive science of humans and animals comparatively. They're sponsoring a series of lectures, one this week on February 15th by Alexandra Horowitz from Barnard College on what is it like to be a dog, on dog cognition. February 22nd, Peter Godfrey Smith will be speaking on paths to the evolution of consciousness. On April 5th, Mark Moffett of the Smithsonian, ant biologist, will be speaking on social identity in ant and human societies. And on April 26th, Ann Harrington from Harvard Psychology will be speaking of Mindful Minds, America's Love Affair with Meditation. Other events are co-sponsored or sponsored by the Franke Program coming up in the spring. On February 24th, we will co-sponsor with the History of Science and Medicine program. We'll talk by Dr. Sam Roberts, director of the Columbia University Institute for Research in African American Studies and associate professor of history and social medical sciences. He'll be speaking in a conference on critical histories and activist futures, science, medicine, and racial violence at the Yale Medical School. That's at 5 p.m. We're also on Friday, March 3rd, we'll be co-sponsoring a conference with the American Studies Program and the Center for Race, Indigeneity, and Transnational Migration here at Yale, a conference on mapping for social justice, approaches with new media and digital humanities, with speakers from 8 different universities visiting for that whole day program. On April 10th, we have Andrea Wolf, who will be speaking on The Invention of Nature, her award-winning biography of Alexander von Humboldt, a spectacular book, and I'm sure an exciting talk. On Monday, April 17th, we have Dr. Hasok Chang, historian and philosopher of science from Cambridge University, speaking on Is There Room for Pluralism in Science? That will be here in the Whitney at 4 p.m. on the 17th. And then on April 22nd, we co-sponsor with the Yale Environmental History Program a conference on new perspectives in environmental history. That'll be in Luce Hall all day on April 22nd. So before I get started, I want to thank, of course, Ty Camp, assistant director here in the Franke Program, and also the Whitney Humanities Center staff, always supporting our activities marvelously. So today it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Robin Wall Kimmerer, who is a moss biologist, ecologist, and an acclaimed writer. She is a SUNY Distinguished Teaching Professor at the SUNY College of Environmental Science and Forestry in Syracuse, New York. She's also founding director at the college of the Center for Native Peoples and the Environment, the mission of which is to create programs which draw on the wisdom of both indigenous and scientific knowledge for the shared goal of sustainability. Professor Kimmerer's research includes reproductive ecology, dispersal, and community ecology of mosses in northeastern North America, and more recently, the role of traditional ecological knowledge in ecological restoration. In collaboration with tribal partners, she and her students have an active research program in the ecology and restoration of plants of cultural significance to Native people. Professor Kimmerer is a member of the Potawatomi Nation, and she is the co-founder and past president of the Traditional Ecological Knowledge section of the Ecological Society of America. Professor Kimmerer is the author of numerous scientific papers on ecology of moss, restoration ecology, and on contributions to traditional ecology knowledge to understanding our natural world. She is also the author of a number of acclaimed books, including Gathering Moss, which is an intimate account of the biology and lives of mosses. Gathering Moss was awarded the prestigious John Burroughs Medal for nature writing in 2005. Her book, Braiding Sweetgrass, Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and the Teaching of Plants, was also awarded the Sigurd Olson Nature Writing Award in 2013. Throughout her writing, Robin Kimmerer uses her elegant and visionary voice to tell intimate stories about small, forgotten, or overlooked communities, from the tiny assemblages of mosses in the forest to the original indigenous nations of this continent. Join me in welcoming Robin Wall Kimmerer. Before we get started, I want to also let you know that there'll be a reception after the talk directly down the hallway, at the end of the hallway. So please stay around and join us for that continuing conversation.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for being here, for taking the time to come together and share ideas. Thanks to the Franke Center for this wonderful invitation. And you know, having invited a plant ecologist to come and speak with you, you might be thinking we're going to see some data today. Nope. I love a good p-value as much as the next scientist, but the kind of values we're going to be talking about today lie at the intersection of nature and culture. We're really going to be looking at human values. And instead of graphs and tables, we're really going to use what my friend John Talmadge has called the most sophisticated communication technology ever devised. And my students always say, "You mean Google?" And no, I say, I mean the story. So we're going to talk stories today. But first, I want to greet you in my language. I don't speak much of our language, but our teachers and our elders tell us that because our language is an endangered species, we really need to breathe life into it whenever we can and use it. So in the Potawatomi language, I greet you. I say, Bojo, Bojo. Shabadaske gish kokwen na deshankos, bodwe wadmi kwenda. Megaze do dem, minwa makodo dem. Nin mamikwenda mampi yayan. I've told you that I am a Potawatomi woman, that my name is Shabadaske gish kokwe, the light shining through sky woman. I'm a member of the Bear Clan and also of the Eagles, and I'm very grateful to be here with you. And gratitude is our first responsibility. And so let's just take a moment to begin with gratitude, to remember that this morning when we woke up, we put our feet on Mother Earth and everything that we needed was provided for us. That we had water to drink, we had beautiful clouds moving across the sky with that beautiful air, we had food, we had the companionship of geese in the sky, and the companionship of the bare-branched maples, and the companionship of each other. So many gifts that come to us, and our first responsibility then is gratitude. And I also want to give a special gratitude to the original peoples of this place, the Pequot peoples, on whose ancestral territory we are sitting at this very moment. To introduce today's talk about the teachings of plants, I want to introduce you to one of my great teachers, this plant called weengosh, sweetgrass. Sweetgrass, in our language, that word weengosh actually means something about the beautiful fragrance of that plant. It has a lovely sort of vanilla odor to it. It means the open, wet meadows where it grows. And it also means a call to ceremony and a call to prayer, because this is a sacred plant for us. This is a medicine plant. It simultaneously heals the earth because it's an early successional rhizomatous perennial that binds up disturbed soil. but it is also a healer of spirit as well. So this is an important medicine plant. And while we call it Weengashk, you may know it as sweetgrass. Linnaeus called it Hierocloe odorata. And in botanical Latin, that means the sacred, fragrant, holy grass. So I think Linnaeus knew this plant very well. We'll get back to Linnaeus in just a little bit. When you see Weengashk like this, you almost always see sweetgrass braided. Anybody know why that is?
Make it stronger.
It is certainly stronger. The reason that we braid sweetgrass is that sweetgrass is part of our creation stories, and that sweetgrass is understood as one of the first plants that grows on Earth, and we think of it as the hair of Mother Earth. And so now you know why we braid it. Think about the last time you braided someone's hair, or someone braided your hair. And the gentle smiles that I just saw emerge here tell us why we braid sweetgrass. Because it's a form of relationship, isn't it? Braiding. We braid Mother Earth's hair in the form of sweetgrass as a sign of our tender care for her. And so this important plant comes to us as a braid. And we'll have more to say about that in a little bit. This notion of braiding sweetgrass, those three strands, I also use as the dominant metaphor in the book Braiding Sweetgrass, thinking about each one of those strands, of those three strands, one as scientific knowledge, one of them as indigenous traditional knowledge, and the third, the knowledge of the plants themselves. Because both traditional knowledge and scientific knowledge are constructed knowledge by humans. But we also have to acknowledge the inherent wisdom and knowledge that are in the plants. And so that too is represented in this braid, all these ways of knowing. But I have to tell you that the relationship for me as a native scientist of those three ways of knowing has not always been an easy one, as you might imagine. And let me just tell you a little story about that. Here you see, of course, beautiful goldenrod and asters, that purple and yellow. They're so stunning together in the fall. And I always loved this combination of plants. And I was born a botanist. I can't remember a time when I wasn't attracted to and engaged with plants. And this particular pair has always been my favorite. So when it came time to go to college, I knew I had to study botany. And when I went to school, on my very first day, my freshman advisor said to me, "So, Miss Wall, why do you want to be a botanist?" And I said, "I want to know why goldenrod and New England asters look beautiful together." That's just what he did. I wanted to know about relationship. I wanted to know about harmony and beauty, because these plants do look so stunning together, and they often grow intermixed. So they're aesthetically so gorgeous, and I thought there must be ecological meaning to that as well. But he said, "My dear, that is not science." And so as a person very much interested in traditional indigenous ways of knowing, I said, well, I also want to know why plants make medicine and why you can bend willows for baskets and not other plants. And he said, also not science. He said, if you want to know those things, you shouldn't be in science. And so this was my first encounter with the scientific worldview, coming from an indigenous worldview of growing up on the land in my community. And that's why I look so happy in my freshman photo. I was stunned, quite honestly, because I thought a question of beauty was a darn good question. But I was told it wasn't, that it didn't matter, and that if I was interested in beauty, I should have gone to art school. And I had no vocabulary for resistance. I didn't know what to do about this. I thought that I must have made a mistake about what was important to me and interesting about plants. And so he signed me up for my general botany classes, and I went right in to take them. But now thinking back on that day and my gleeful look on my first day getting to study botany, which was my dream come true, was that it was really a very powerful echo of my grandfather's first day at school. And my grandfather's first day of school was when he was 9 years old, when he was taken from our reservation in Oklahoma and put on a train and sent to the Carlisle Indian School. His first day of school, kind of like mine, where we were told, what you think doesn't matter. Your way of knowing, there's no room for that here. But they didn't cut my hair, and I could still speak my own language. Kind of. Because my language of nature was nature as subject. I understood the plants and the animals, the insects, the birds around me as beings, as persons. And that the land, which I was being told was the ecosystem, I understood as a community of sovereign beings. And with that worldview, I have to tell you that studying botany was really challenging, because the organisms that I had thought of as persons, in a sense, were now reduced to objects. And in fact, this was the model that we were given of ecology, that this is what an ecosystem was. The ecosystem as machine, not as community. I thought I had wandered into an engineering class by mistake. Nature as object. Because again, within the indigenous way of thinking, I was raised to understand that every person has these 4 ways depicted in our medicine wheel of understanding the world: mind, body, emotion, and spirit. And we're always told that unless you understand with all of these 4 gifts of human beings, you don't really understand it. But in going to the scientific worldview, I went to a worldview that just privileges the intellect and that which can be observed and measured by science, but that very deliberately sets aside spirit and emotion, are those other gifts that we have. I had walked out of a worldview in which land is understood as a web of relationship that brings all those things together. What we didn't really understand, I think, at that point was you mentioned pluralism, that you have a speaker coming to talk about pluralism in science, that just as we know that the driver of biological evolution is genetic diversity, that if we think about cultural evolution toward sustainability, toward right relationship with the earth, that requires intellectual diversity. It requires all kinds of ways of understanding our relationships. And that is really the work that we are doing at the Center for Native Peoples and the Environment, is to bring together the wisdom and practices of traditional indigenous environmental philosophy paired with the tools of Western science to solve our most pressing environmental problems. And we like to think of it not so much as a monoculture. I don't know about you, but what I experienced as a brand new college student was an intellectual monoculture, that the way to understand nature was through the scientific lens only. But what we're thinking about doing, and we're trying to practice in our center, is to create a knowledge garden inspired by the Three Sisters polyculture, grown by Native peoples all over the continent, where you know that corn, beans, and squash are not grown in isolation, but they're grown together, right? And it reduces competition between them. They partner, they support one another, but the beans don't become the squash, right? There's not a privileging of one over the other, or a blending. We have sovereign ways of knowing that support each other. And so the knowledge garden that we are trying to create is this one, where we have a symbiosis between traditional ecological knowledge and Western science, and then ourselves as teachers, as educators, as thinkers, to help create that symbiosis. This is what we are trying to do. So if we go back here to this notion of nature as object versus nature as subject, this question of the nature of nature, if you will, is certainly not a new one. And what I want to talk to you about today is the notion of object versus subject in plants, and thinking about plants as persons and what we gain in that dialogue. two books that I want to recommend to you if this is of any interest to you at all. These wonderful books, The Philosopher's Plant and Plants as Persons, are really great treatises that have informed a lot of my thinking. And we will begin, as we do in the Western canon, with the classics, right? The Greek philosophers who thought about the nature of other beings, and whether or not plants were living beings was an active area of discussion. And many of the early philosophers, Plato and Theophrastus, who was sort of the father of botany, concluded that while plants were very, very different from animals, they were definitely living things. They were not as close to rocks as many of their contemporaries had thought. They actually said that plants have souls. They have virtuous souls, which are associated with their beauty, with their generosity, and with their provisioning for everybody else. But Aristotle suggested otherwise. I love this quote. Some have said that plants have intelligence and can acquire knowledge. Let us dismiss these theories as trivial and abide by sound reasoning. He thought that if plants had any notion of soul or beingness, is what he called a vegetal soul. And a vegetal soul simply meant that they had enough going on to grow and to reproduce, but that's it. And of course, you think in the Scala Natura, the great chain of being, where do plants occur? Way down at the bottom of this hierarchical ranked system, right? In which the angels are on the top, humans just below them, and plants just above the rocks. And this notion of plants as primitive, the hierarchical ranking of beings, certainly underpins much of our botanical sciences today, as we'll see in just a second. So this Western worldview, placement of plants as low man on the totem pole, right? That they are at the bottom of biological hierarchies, primitive, lacking in most capacities. Well, I would say that idea of low man on the totem pole needs some critique in a number of regards. Particularly, what does it mean to be low man on the totem pole? A common misperception by Westerners looking at this marvelous art of the Pacific Northwest coast is that the one who is on top of the totem pole is the most powerful and the most honored. That's pretty consistent with our biological hierarchies, right, where we are at the really top. But that's not true. In this art form, the most influential, the one on which everyone relies, is at the bottom of the totem pole, perhaps right where plants are, the most influential and important, taking their place right there. Like the plants at the base of the food chain, they hold everything else up. And in contrast to this hierarchical way of thinking about plants, with plants at the bottom and humans at the top, in the indigenous worldview, from the dream time of Aboriginal Australians to my own Potawatomi people, the plants are viewed as persons, as full-fledged persons, with their own gifts, their own intelligences, their own intentions, their own ways of being in the world. And when I say that plants are understood as persons, I don't mean this kind of person, a fictional person like the familiar Ents of Fanghorn Forest. And I certainly don't mean these persons. Isn't it interesting? All you have to do is put a face on things, and suddenly they become beings. Anthropomorphism at its very best, a smile on a carrot. The kind of personhood that I mean, as a reflection of indigenous ways of knowing, is not anthropomorphic. It is not assigning human characters to plants at all. In fact, what it does is to celebrate the fact that plants are very different ways of being than humankind. But they too are persons. They too are autonomous beings with their own experiences, their own perceptions, and indeed their own agency in the world. A person can have intelligence, sensation, self-recognition. A person bears their own capacities. And most importantly to our discussion today, a person is capable of entering into relationship, particularly into reciprocal relationships. Not only in Potawatomi culture and those of many of my relative nations, are plants viewed as persons, but they are viewed as teachers, as among our highest, most revered of teachers. And why should this be? In the Western world, these organisms which are viewed as practically nothing, close to the rocks, are revered as teachers among indigenous peoples. Part of it is the understanding that they have been here on Earth far longer than any other beings. But there's really the recognition that what other beings on Earth can take light and air and water and make food and then give it away. Great healthcare plan or food plan. They make medicine too. That's their healthcare plan. They make medicines and give them away for free. Plants are understood as generous agents, generative agents as well, creative beings that teach us how to be in the world, teach us what it is to be a right being in the world, because you're constantly engaged in give and take. And so you see that if you come with that worldview into the botany lab, where you're just simply dissecting plants and thinking of them as objects, that's kind of an uphill slog. So I'm so excited by the new fields of plant neurobiology that are doing some really amazing work to demonstrate, in fact, that plants do have their own agency, right? That plants can make choices, that plants can hear and respond to sounds, that plants have memory, that plants can plan ahead. All of these attributes of personhood, of beingness, that we're now finding in the plant biology laboratories are in a sense an echo of what our traditional teachers always told us. And there's certainly no question that plants provide generously, as their original instructions were to do, for all of us, for human beings, given all the medicines that they make us, the other resources that they make us. And I want to pause for a moment on that term resources, because whether it be food or timber or ecosystem services, all of these things are things that my natural resource conservation biology colleagues refer to as either ecosystem services or natural resources. And that language has certain consequences, doesn't it? When we think about the beingness of plants. Natural resources, that which is not valuable until it is transmuted into something that humans need. The language in our Potawatomi language, of which I am just a beginning student, the name that we would give to natural resources is gifts. That all of these are gifts. And gifts, therefore, open us to a relationship, don't they? When somebody gives us a gift, what do we do with that gift? What do we do in response to that gift? We what? We say thank you. We enter into gratitude. And as I said, gratitude is our first responsibility, because gratitude acknowledges the gifts of the world, things that we have not bought and paid for, things that we don't necessarily deserve, but they are given to us. And when somebody gives you a gift, yes, you say thank you. And then what? What's the next step? You give back, right? Gratitude and gift open the door to reciprocity. And this is another reason that the plants are understood as our teachers, because they teach us from the seed to the fruit and back to the seed. They teach us about reciprocity and what is our role. So if we think about plants as our teachers, the question then becomes, how can we be better students? What is it that they are teaching us, and how can we be better students? And I want to tell you another story about that related to notions of sustainability. My friend Carol Crow, who is an Algonquin biologist, went to her band council, which is the tribal government, to ask for a grant to go to a conference on sustainability. And so she went before her elders and was asking, and they said, well, what's sustainability? And she kind of laughed, thinking, well, that's the way our people have been living so well in this place for millennia. But she used these definitions that are familiar to all of you, right? Lots and lots of different definitions of this slippery word, sustainability. But in these excerpts that I've highlighted here, one of the things that is certainly present in all of these, ensure the attainment and continued satisfaction of human needs, continue to provide, do not diminish the potential to meet the needs. So she told her elders all that. And they were very quiet. And she thought they were going to turn her down. And they said, no, we want you to go. It's very important that you go to that meeting. But we want you to go and tell them something, carry a message, and tell them that their idea of sustainability is really a way to just keep on taking. Just keep on taking. They said to her, you go and tell them that it's not our right to keep taking. When our feet hit the ground in the morning, we should be thinking what it is that we have to give. Just as the plants are constantly giving to us in reciprocity, what is it that we have to give back in return for this shower of gifts that comes to us every day? And sustainability as a powerful cultural goal is completely reframed by this notion, isn't it? Of not about taking, but about giving. And this is one of the instances in which the lens of indigenous knowledge and environmental philosophy can reshape the way that we think and contribute to that cultural evolution we spoke of at the outset. Because traditional ecological knowledge is full of stories and practices and philosophies about ways in which human people have a beneficial relationship with the earth. When I teach general ecology, I ask my students, how well versed are you in negative relationships between people and the earth? And every hand goes up. They know all about that. But then when I ask them the opposite, what about positive relationships between people and the earth? There are very few hands. And so how is it that we're trying to train the next generation of environmental stewards when we cannot even imagine what positive, mutualistic, reciprocal relationships might look like with the earth? And this lens, this framework from the indigenous worldview is a powerful tool for moving there. In fact, what Carol's elders, the Cree elders, were essentially saying is that we should be thinking not what more can we take from the earth, but what does the earth ask of us? What is our role as human people in response to these gifts? How do we reciprocate the many gifts of plants, from every breath of oxygen that we take to food, to medicine, to beauty, to companionship, to them being our teachers? And one of the most powerful ways, in a world that is full of monarch butterflies and goldenrod and asters and redwoods and salamanders and blue jays, a world which is full of all of these other beings, shouldn't we at least be paying attention? And we're not. Our whole society suffers greatly from what has been called plant blindness, of not really even being aware of the gifts of plants. And one of the ways that we talk about paying attention is by knowing names. And yeah, I'm a botanist, so of course you think, well, yep, she's going to go on about plant taxonomy now. Well, yeah, a little. But more than that, when you come to know the name of your neighbor, doesn't that bring you into relationship? It opens the potential for reciprocity. When you don't even bother to learn the name of somebody around you, that's a sign of disrespect. And so by not knowing the name of the one who makes the aspirin for you every day, or the one who makes the syrup that you pour on your pancakes on Sunday morning, you don't even know their names, it's an act of disrespect. And so there's the notion of learning names by paying attention. This little plant grows in everybody's backyard here, I'm sure, or along your sidewalk. Does anybody know this plant? Yes, wonderful. Say that again. I'm in a botanically literate audience. Heal all. That would be a good name to know, wouldn't it? If you just needed to start with one plant name, heal all would probably be a good one. Remarkable plant. I wish I had time to talk all about its chemistry, but it does. It really heals a lot. The plants? This is a camas meadow, Camassia chumash. A plant, again, all of these plants are in here because they are stories of reciprocity. This is a plant that people need to tend by burning in order to bring the camas to fruit. Okay, paying attention, knowing names. A number of educators, of course, have pointed out that we are natural taxonomists. We categorize, we learn names like crazy, and our kids, and let's face it, ourselves, we're pretty good at this, aren't we? Recognizing corporate logos. Who is it that really sustains us in the world? Where are we giving our attention? Our natural our natural tendency to pay attention to that which supports our life has, in a sense, been hijacked by advertisers. It is, to me, terrifying that kids can recognize 100 corporate logos and recognize fewer than 10 plants. The average American knows fewer than 10 plants, and you know what tops the list? Christmas tree and grass. So those don't hardly even count, right? So we have a problem with plant blindness. How can we understand and relate to the world as gift if we don't even know the gift givers, if we don't even know their names or anything about what it is that they offer us every single day? How can we be better students of plants? Pay attention, know about their gifts, share that knowledge with those around you. And speaking of plant names, I said I'd get back to Linnaeus, right? Hierocloe odorata, that he gave the name to sweetgrass. What you see here are two great botanists and namers. We all know that Linnaeus is the great namer, and when we took Bio 101, we were told that he was, in fact, the father of naming and taxonomy. Because before 1770, no one had names for plants. Well, on the other side, you see Nana Bojo in our culture. You know, when Nana Bojo came to the earth as the first man, Anishinaabe man, he was given a job by the Creator, and his job was to give names. But how was he different from Linnaeus? Linnaeus bestowed names in a foreign language, right, in a standardized scientific nomenclature. He bestowed names. And naming, as we know, is a powerful act of control as well as attention. How did Nanabush do it? Nanabush didn't give names. His job was to wander the world, getting to know all the plants and animals so well that they would reveal to him their real names. And here we see, again, this subject versus object. Who has the right to give a name? If it's an object, you can call it anything you want. If it's a subject, you wouldn't presume. You would wait to know and have it, the true name be revealed. So we have, again, this different lenses for looking at the beingness of nature as object and subject. And this brings me to, how am I doing now? There we go, I can see the clock now. A peculiarity of language. We talked about natural resources versus gift as an interesting linguistic idea. But I'd like you to think for just a little bit about how we refer to the living world in the English language. All these beings, all these gifts. And if I was to say something about Mako, or the bear, I would have to say, it's scratching the tree, right? It. I would have to refer to all of these beings as it. Because in English, we have a very peculiar grammar that we don't often think about. But in English, you're either a human or you're an it. If your grandma was standing there, making soup at the stove, and someone said, oh, look, it's wearing an apron. That's not right. It's not only rude, But we just really disrespected her, right? We took her humanity, her personhood away from her. She who was about to provide for us. But in English, how do we speak of all of those bearers of gifts in the natural world who provide for us? We only say it of them, right? And even in our language, in our beautiful English language, this notion of object and the lack of personhood, lack of beingness is present. And I think that we can think about this in the consequences for our worldview and the way that we relate to the land. This imposition of the notion of it is really a tool of linguistic imperialism. It is a tool of colonization, which we feel acutely today in our relationships with the living world. And you know, in the Potawatomi language, it's impossible to say it of the living world. You can't do it. We speak of that blue jay and of that strawberry with the same grammar that we use for our family members, because they are our family members. And so encoded in this little piece of grammar is a worldview, isn't it, of objectified nature. And if nature is an object, if it's not made up of beings and persons, then we have a certain kind of permission, if you will, to exploit it. Because when we objectify people, when we objectify nature, we're very good at this, it creates a circle of moral exclusion. It says you're other. And generally speaking, where are natural beings on that hierarchy? Those others are lower than, lesser than beings. And so this objectification of nature, which is captured in our worldview and in our language, I think is emblematic of our relationship. And so what I'd like to do is to invite you into a little experiment to think about how indigenous languages the world over have this concept of animacy in the language, that you cannot say it about a living being. It's just not possible. We speak a grammar of animacy. And could we in some way animate English? Could we step away from objectification of the living world by being very conscious about the way that we speak? And so the proposal is a modest proposal. The pronouns of the revolution reclaim the grammar of animacy, begin to change our thinking and the way that we behave in the living world through grammar. And I thought for a long time of how in the world could you do this? So I asked one of my elders, my language teachers, is there a word in Potawatomi for a living being of the earth, so that they don't, not to say that they are humans, it's not anthropomorphism, but you're a being. Is there a word? And there is, it's Bamadazi Aki, and it simply means a living being of the good earth. Actually means a good being of the living earth, that's right. And so there is a word for it, there is a concept for it, which is built into our language. And when we look at that beautiful word, Bamadazi Aki, in a culture where we rarely tolerate speaking a language other than English, I don't think that incorporation of Bamadazi Aki into our language is really going to work. But what about ki? Ki, that last phoneme on the beautiful word Aki, which means the earth, which sounds a bit like he and she. Could we refer to living beings not as its with a disrespectful objectification, as if they were just a paperclip or a pencil? We use it for them, not for sacred living beings who are our teachers and our providers. Could we say of that maple tree in the spring, ki is giving us sap this year? Ki is branches are waving in the wind. Could we refine our language and pause for a moment to think, are these living beings or are they objects? And I went back and forth with my elders talking about this word, and we had some concerns about cultural appropriation associated with this, with inspiring a new grammar of animacy. And we had lots of very interesting discussions about that. So we were really grateful that English already has a word that works for the plural of ki. Because in Potawatomi, to make a word plural, you add an N. We already have that word. We already have that word. So that when the geese fly back in the spring, we can say, kin are filling the skies. Welcome back. So that every time we speak of the living world, we speak of relationship, of respectful relationship with place and with beings. How do we reciprocate the gifts of the plants? This notion of personhood is far more than a notion of a pronoun. What we're really talking about is extension of thinking about personhood to living beings, right? And this has ramifications in the political, legal worlds, as well as the ecological worlds, because what you're looking at here is the sacred river of the Maori people. This is the Wanganui River that 4 years ago was declared a legal person. Out of the Maori concepts of animacy of all beings, that river is understood and has legal personhood. So decisions about that river need to be made for the well-being of that river. So these ideas of personhood are not kind of arcane constructs. They have real meaning in the world. It's really interesting, isn't it, that in this country, the only things that can be recognized as legal persons, aside from ourselves, are corporations, right? But the rest of particularly in the indigenous-led world, has other ideas about that. Because as you know, in Ecuador, the Constitution of Ecuador enshrines the personhood of nature, assigning rights to Pachamama, rights to, that Mother Nature has her own inherent rights. Implementation of this is far more difficult than conceptualization of it, but here we have it. And it's true in Bolivia as well. And Bolivia was the leader of a coalition to bring before the United Nations the Universal Declaration of the Rights of Mother Earth, which is also this notion of personhood, of subjecthood for Mother Nature, for Pachamama, for Gaia, for all the different languages in which we think of her. And so these ideas from indigenous ways of thinking of plants as persons, as teachers, as esteemed beings, is finding its way into international law. The Paris Climate Talks was one of the first courts for crimes against nature, in addition, parallel to crimes against humanity. So if we consider plants to be persons, that has implications for how we relate to plants as consumers, does it not? If plants are persons. In the Western world, where we say that plants are not persons, or even so much, in many cases, beings, that certainly not legal persons, we refer to them all as its, that permission to exploit means that we don't really have to worry about the ethical consequences of it, because it's just a thing. And they are outside our circle of moral or ecological compassion. In indigenous ways of thinking, remember, if we're thinking about the plants as beings, as teachers, as our relatives, and we're going to eat them, this sets up certain ethical tensions for sure. But it's really important that they're there, because as human beings, we can't photosynthesize. We have to eat plants. We can't just call them it and have no ethics associated with it. We recognize them as persons and our relatives, so we have to have very special ethics associated with honoring the lives that they give us. And this is encoded in a series of practices which are understood as the honorable harvest. So when we recognize the plants as gift givers, as beings, as teachers, rules come up for essentially consuming your beloved family. And these rules were taught to me as a berry picker, as a medicine gatherer, And they may seem at first like kind of quaint prescriptions for how it is that we go berry picking, but I think you'll see that they are potentially very strong ways to reconceptualize and enact our relationship with the earth. When I go to pick berries, maybe this is the same for you, we say that we never take the first one. We come upon the first ones and we greet them and say thank you to them, and we pass them by. This self-restraint is an inherent conservation ethic, isn't it? Because if you don't take the first one, you're not going to take the last one. And when we come to the one that we can take, in some cultures it's the third one, some cultures it's the seventh one, we ask permission. We actually speak to that plant, introduce ourselves, and ask that plant if it has enough to share. Would you allow me to bring some medicine home for my daughter, some berries home for that pie? We ask permission. And I understand that if you came upon somebody in the woods who was talking to a patch of strawberries, you might think that they were a little over the edge. But in our culture, it's just good manners. It's good manners. Would you go into your grandmother's house and start rifling through her cupboards for cookies? Yeah, you laughed. Yeah, only once. You'd only do that once, right? And in a sense, that's how we treat our beloved grandmother, the earth. We just go take whatever we want. But the honorable harvest says, no, you don't. You ask permission. You ask permission, and then your grandma will probably give you all the cookies that you want on her best china plate. And if you ask permission, you have to listen for the answer. And understanding plants as beings, as persons, there are many ways to answer that. As a scientist, I listen for that answer and look at the population density. I look at the vigor of the plants. Do they have enough to share? So on and so forth. There are biological, empirical ways to listen for that answer. But there are also intuitive ways to listen for that answer. And if the answer is no, you go home. You go home with an empty basket because they don't belong to you. If we take without permission, what is that called? Stealing, right. So we take with honor. We don't take unless we have permission. Take only what you need, of course. We all know that. Much harder to practice. Minimize harm in the way that you're taking it. The lesson that was given to me is never use a shovel if a digging stick will do. Use appropriate technology. Minimize the harm that comes from your taking from the natural world. Use everything that you take because you are taking a life. You are taking a life, or a life is being given to you in this gift from the plants. All this applies to animals as well, and we don't disrespect that. Practice gratitude. Be grateful. Be grateful for everything that is given to you. And gratitude, again, may seem like sort of a hollow good manners or politeness. But gratitude is really powerful because when you practice gratitude, it helps you remember that you have everything that you need already. It makes you feel abundant. And gratitude, practicing gratitude, brings you into relationship with all that is, with those beings. You can't feel separated when you're grateful. And you know what? I've recently read some really interesting studies about consumption. And we know that it is consumption that has us hanging on the brink of climate chaos. It is consumption that has led us into the 6th extinction. And you know, one of the correlates to restraint on consumption is gratitude. People who practice gratitude consume less. So this ethic has real concrete repercussions. Share everything that you've taken. The plants have shared with you, and so we then have to share what we've taken. You take those strawberries and give them to somebody else, as well as to your family. And always reciprocate the gift. In return for those berries, for that root, you need to give something back. And there's a lot of teachings about what that something could be. It could be, in the case of berries, you're going to weed around them and reduce the competition for them. It could be you're going to pick the bugs off. It could be you're going to take the seeds and carry them to a new place and plant them. the really practical things that your gift of attention and respect pay off for that plant so that you flourish and the plant flourishes as well. Oftentimes the gifts are also spiritual in nature. Giving a prayer, giving words, giving a song, giving, in my culture, tobacco, sacred plant, giving back to that plant. So reciprocating the gift is a very important law of taking. And I'm almost out of time, so I think what I want to do is to close with this notion of reciprocity and the gift. In our culture, we are told that gifts and responsibilities are two sides of the same coin. So that when we think about a bird singing in the morning, we'd say, well, that bird was given this beautiful gift of song. And then the whole world receives it as a gift because it's so beautiful and makes you feel so good in the morning. But in return for that gift that the bird was given, it has a responsibility to sing up the sun. So the gift comes with a responsibility, right? So and that's what we mean. The stars were given this gift of twinkling and the responsibility to show us our directions at night. Everything comes in this duality of gift and responsibility. And when we think about the difficulties that face us in this particular time, we could ask ourselves with heavy heart, what's my responsibility? And sometimes that's harder to answer. But what if you asked yourself, what is my gift? What is my gift? And then that becomes, giving your gift becomes a responsibility. And is your gift as a teacher, as a scientist, as an artist, as a writer, as a parent, as a gardener, as an engineer? What is your gift? And the notion of this coupling of gifts and responsibilities is that in return for the gifts that we are given by the earth, that each of us is called upon to give our gift in return. So that collectively we might do what Onondaga clan mother Audrey Shenandoah beseeched us to do, and that is to seek justice, not only for ourselves, but justice for all creation. Miigwech, mi'u, thank you very much. Thank you.
You have an opportunity for some questions?
Sure.
I'm going to let you take them.
You bet. You bet. Any questions? Any questions or comments?
Bring it to you.
Oh, here comes one.
Thank you, Robin. It's a beautiful talk, John Grimm. I recall in an article by Winona LeDuc that she opened it by talking about Bima Dziwin, and she translated it or gave it as long life, happiness, living into old age. And I caught among your names of the plant, Bima Dizate.
Bimadazi Aki.
So I was looking for the relationship between the Ojibwe rendition of a value in life, a primary, central value in life, and here this value is then embedded in plants.
Yes, and to clarify, Ojibwe and Potawatomi are very close languages, a member of the same language family, and the notion of Bimadiziwin means a good and full life. It has many nuances of what does it mean to have a good and full life, but and it literally means to walk in a good way on the earth. So the notion of Bimadazi Aki that I've used here is one who is living that Bimadazi win on the earth. So yeah. Yes, yeah. Good question.
Thank you very much. I can feel very moved. I can feel very close to so many of the concepts that you are talking about today. I feel that my culture is so far away from Jeez. So I'm wondering, how do we take the steps, little or small, to begin to turn that around as individuals in this society?
Yeah. Amy,
Sorry.
No, Amy, I honor your emotion about that, because it is a grief. It is a grief to know that we have this world of these beings who are sustaining us, and the way we treat those who take care of us in such a way is a source of grief. And I really think about Joanna Macy's wonderful work of understanding that our grief is a measure of our love. And that, to me, as we try to heal this great rift of objectification of the living world, I think the notion of paying attention is really, really important, and not relegating paying attention to living beings to nature over there. That we have to go to the rainforests of Ecuador to know nature, that we have to go to the Adirondacks to know nature, that our regard for living beings are in our garden and in the cracks of our sidewalk. Pay attention. Pay attention. And I think that all of these things that could transform the way that we are our human gifts. We don't have to invent this, because we're really good at gratitude. We're really good at gift giving. And when we turn those to the living beings around us, then we really have something. We don't have to invent something new. We have to extend the compassion that we feel sometimes, for some humans, to the living world.
But then maybe as a follow-up, I can see us individually committing to that and doing that. Do you have any insights as to how we create greater change in our entire society and the consumerism that we do embody, that we see all around us, our governance and things like that? Do you have thoughts on how that can become big enough so that there is systemic change?
Yeah. Of course, like probably every one of us in this room, we wrestle with exactly that question of how do we scale this to worldview change, because that is what we're doing. We have to scale it. And one of the things that I have found important to talk about, and the reason that I spend a great deal of time and effort both writing and teaching and speaking about indigenous knowledge systems, is because I think we have somehow gotten trapped into the notion that the relationship, the damaged relationship that you're talking about, the one that brings us grief through our estrangement from the living world, we tend to think that that's our default, that's just the way it is. That's just the way it is for humanity. But what we have forgotten is that it's really just an eye blink of time that we have been in this objectified worldview. For most of human history, we have lived with notions of gratitude and reciprocity and lived well and richly. It is if we have been doing an experiment since the Industrial Revolution of what would it be like if we treated the world as if it was it, instead of you, instead of ki, instead of kin. We've been doing an experiment to say, what if we treated the world as if it was dead? And the experiments, or the data from, the results from those experiments are in, right? And we don't like them. And so I think it's really important to know that and to speak about that there are other ways to be that are coherent, long products of cultural evolution in place. And there are so many tools. I mean, when we talk about being there, being on the land, paying attention, conversations, stories, science, all the gifts that every one of you in this room possess, if deployed toward this notion, I think can be very powerful. It's not going to happen from the top.
Hi. Thanks. I'm Irina. Thank you for your talk. I was wondering, I was very intrigued by your thoughts on language and culture, sort of what you alluded to just now. And I'm from Greece. So in Greek language, we do have gender for everything. We don't say it pretty much for anything, except for a few neutral things. But I regret to say that doesn't make us any more nicer to the earth or
Yes.
thoughtful or anything.
Yes.
What do you think it's going to take other than changing the language in terms of, getting people to actually see that, and what are the other tools that we can use? Because I feel like language might be one small part of it, but it will take a lot more.
Absolutely, absolutely. People have brought me so many examples of, wait, we have animacy in our language, and yeah, we're not doing so well. It certainly isn't, and we're not talking about deterministic here. It is often correlated, but it's certainly not deterministic. One of my students actually had an interesting insight about this notion of the changed pronouns. She said, do you remember that we used to say when the fire truck would go by, we would say, well, the firemen are going to, put out the fire. But do we say that anymore? We say firefighters, don't we? A cultural shift has occurred, a little cultural shift in language, and we pause, and we say firefighter, because in that pause we're saying both men and women can put out blazes. And just in that pause of choosing to use a different word, it reflects change and it propels change. And so this notion of pausing before saying it about living beings could have some of that same effect. But it's about so much more than language. What we really need is a change of heart. And this is why, for me, as a scientist, I feel like I don't think we need more data. I don't think we need more information. I don't think we need to change technology. We need to change our hearts. But truthfully, I think that we already have that. That we have that innate sense of wonder and love and beauty for the natural world, but we have to let it out. We have to free it. And there's all these things around us that push us down so that we can't. But we have to just choose it. We have to choose it.
Maybe a partial hopeful answer about how we can, maybe a partial hopeful answer about how we can start to move the society a little bit. I thought I was the only one. I thought, in fact, that my recent and incredibly increased attention toward plants, I used to, when my parents were alive, be polite about their gardens, but I wasn't paying attention. After they died, I got so mind-bogglingly amazed at what plants do that, I thought I was being haunted. But anyway, then I realized, as I read around a bit, this is a common pattern, that people as they age frequently do get this way. And I remembered that the Voltaire Candide, at the end of that whole story, what Candide and Cunegonde do is tend their garden into old age. So if, we have an avalanche of aging people here. I think it's time to start to pay attention to plants as a really fine thing that can help heal the society. And the sense of gratitude, as I understand it, is a huge key to happy aging.
Mm-hmm. Well said, well said. And time in the garden is a perfect place to understand plants as beings and plants as gifts and our relationship to them. Yeah. Both the way that you phrased your question and your question itself makes me think of a way to pull together this question that none of us have the answer to, of how do we change our world. But again, I want to come back to this notion of what we already know, that we don't have to invent. And I've come to see my work both as a scientist, as a writer, as a teacher, and as a parent and a grandparent, as a human being, is to help people again come to fall in love with the world. And when we fall in love with the world, All else follows. And a garden is a great place to begin.
Hello. Thank you. I am struck that the way I heard your description of the honorable harvest works really well for very low impact gathering and maybe hunting. But anytime we're doing something else, any kind, even the most ecologically sensitive polyculture farming, or something like selectively burning certain areas to promote the growth of a particular species there, that's us saying we're choosing what lives there, right? When we move around, when we live places, we have these bubbles of controlled ecologies around us, and that in that any of those and these kinds of many different ways, that's a selectively saying we're going to destroy what's here and put something else there or allow something else to grow there, and unless you invoke metaphysics, which I'm not averse to doing, I am a religious person, the rest of the world would be at least as better off, if not much better off, without our participation. And so, I am coming to a place of nihilism that this kind of reciprocal relationship is something that is ever attainable at anywhere.
Yeah. I hear your question, and there's so much more wrapped up in it. The only tiny little story, slides that I didn't get to, is we asked ourselves exactly that question of how can we take in such a way that promotes life, promotes regeneration, in a sense under the agency of the plants. Can we have a true mutualism? And let me just tell you this tiny little story. It is about sweetgrass. We did some experimental work with sweetgrass, which is harvested by basket makers and native people. And I'm trying to think of how to abbreviate this story. The plant was declining. And so one of the questions that the basket makers came to us at the center asking for some help in understanding this, and because the plant was declining, what does Western conservation biology tell us we must do when that plant is becoming endangered? We have to leave it alone, right? Because nature and people are a bad mix. We have to stay away from that. We have to stop harvesting the sweetgrass so that it can recover. The basket makers, the indigenous basket makers, told us something a little bit different. They told us a lot of information. But one of the things that we learned from them is we evaluated the response of sweetgrass to harvesting. And so we had a plot where we didn't take any. And we know what would happen there, right? The sweetgrass would flourish because we weren't messing with it. And then we had other plots where we harvested the sweetgrass according to the honorable harvest. And then we went and used all our plant ecology tools to measure the success. And do you know what happened? The plots of plants that had no human intervention, that had no harvesters there singing to them, receiving their gifts and reciprocating, the control plots that Western science said should thrive, declined. The plots that were harvested according to the honorable harvest doubled in their vigor. What we saw was that practice of the honorable harvest with sweetgrass was a stimulus to the growth of those plants. In accepting the gift and reciprocating it with care, the plants then regenerated. So there are models out there of true mutualism, true reciprocity among beings. And I don't want to oversimplify this in any way because there are plenty of plants that wouldn't respond in that same way. But I hold that up as an example of when we shift our frame to say, well, what are the ways in which humans and plants could be mutually beneficial to one another, we find them. And working with Native communities really around the world, listening to them talk about this concept, there are so many examples of plants that flourish when people harvest them and don't diminish if you use the honorable harvest. A long answer, but a good question. Yes?
Okay. Are you heartened at all? First of all, thank you. That was a wonderful talk. Are you heartened at all by trends like the locavore food movement and community gardens, especially in poor, underserved communities?
Absolutely, absolutely. To me, that is one of the most important, and as you say, heartening examples. When the local food movement began, I was a little skeptical about it. It seemed like it was coming from a place of great privilege and so forth. But what I'm seeing in the local food movement is that it is reawakening our relationship to land, to soil, to water, and it's cutting across all borders, from urban gardens to the indigenous food sovereignty movement, to anti-Monsanto kinds of political movements. So yeah, I think the food movement is a huge indicator and maybe even a tool of reshaping our relationship to Earth, because everybody eats. Thank you very much. Thanks. Thank you.